Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. This is an amazing turnout. Hi, I'm Jamie. Hey, Jamie. Hi. Yeah, thank you. That helps. Oh, hey, too. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I probably have like a 2-hour lecture planned and I have to do in 45 minutes, but don't worry, we're going to get through it. But before I get started, I always like to ask, I want to get just a general sense so I know who I am in the room with. I can't decide if I should ask this question the negative or the positive. Negative, so you're going to have to reveal yourselves. Raise your hand, please, just so I have a sense, if you've never read The Second Sex. Oh, sweet. Okay, cool. I can just make stuff up. Raise your hand if you really don't know who Simone de Beauvoir was. Okay, so most of you have heard of her. You know she was like a big deal. Okay, so if you've been to my olios before, particularly the ones where I speak on Foucault or other sort of big names where I have kind of a devotion to the subject or devotion to the thinker, you've seen this before in my my bit that I'm a firm believer that there's a relationship between knowledge and love, and I think of myself as more of a devotee of the people that I study as opposed to just a student. There are a lot of traditions and thought that adhere to this model that sort of your Obi-Wan, if you really, really love him, you'll become a better Jedi than if you just sort of study his text in a dispassionate way. So I tend to be sort of a devoted student of my gurus. So I was thinking about that tonight in terms, and I usually I even start sometimes with love letters to the people that I read. I do have love letters to Simone. I'm not going to share one with you tonight, but those are a little too personal. But I will start off by talking about, just briefly, this relationship between knowledge and love. And I was thinking about I think it's my favorite quote on the relationship between these two things. It's by a poet named Anne Carson. She wrote a very recommended essay, Eros, the Bittersweet. So I'll start with her. And then we'll move on from there. So this is a quote from Anne Carson on the relationship between knowledge and loving. There would seem to me to be a resemblance between the way Eros acts in the mind of the lover and knowledge acts in the mind of the thinker. It has It has been the endeavor of philosophy since the time of Socrates to understand the nature of that resemblance. I would like to grasp why it is that these two activities, falling in love and coming to know, make me feel genuinely alive. I love that quote, and it's something I very much agree with. And I think it's important before we get started that we think about the way she positioned these things. She didn't say knowing and loving. She said coming into know, coming into knowledge, right? And falling in love. So there's something similar about that experience, I think, between, because they both sort of represent this transition, that experience of the self when you're in limbo between where you are and where you're about to arrive. Another quote that I thought of about the relationship between knowledge and love, Sylvia Plath, if truth can stand in for knowledge in this quote here. She writes, "The truth comes to me, the truth loves me." I love that. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you guys to partake with me in my own methodology. Love me, if you will. And more importantly, let's love the guru. So we're going to start tonight by, I'm going to invite you guys to just, try it. Just fall in love. Okay, so here's our guru. Here's our beloved. And I'm going to invite you guys, before we move forward, it's easy to fall in love. Just take an inhale, and on the exhale, just fall in love. You ready? Right? You feel it? Okay, if you're not quite there yet, I've got one more thing up my sleeve to make your heart beat for Simone. So this is not from The Second Sex. This is from another piece of her writing. This is her memoir. That she has a 3-part memoir. So this is about her younger years when she's just finishing up her degrees, finishing up her Ph.D., which was in her younger years, which was amazing. I won't set this up. I'm just going to give you the passage here. And if this doesn't make you fall in love, there's nothing I can do for you. Okay. This is Simone. A few days later, I had tea with Mademoiselle, and I was bored stiff. When I left her, I went straight to the European. I paid 4 francs for a seat in the balcony among the loose women and even looser men. There were couples locked in each other's arms. Others were kissing. Heavily scented tarts swooned with ecstasy as they listened to the crooner with the slick black hair, and their hoarse laughs made the comic's dirty jokes seem even dirtier. I, too, was excited. I laughed and I felt happy. Why? I even wondered a long time on the Boulevard Barbe, watching the whores and the pimps, no longer with horror, but with a sort of envy. Again, I was surprised at myself. There is within me, I know not what yearning, but maybe a monstrous lust, ever present for noise, fighting, savage violence, and above all, the gutter. What is there to prevent me from becoming a drug addict, an alcoholic, and heaven knows what else? Perhaps all that's lacking is the opportunity, a little greater hankering for everything I shall never know. At times, I was shocked by this perversion, by these baser instincts, which I discovered in myself. What would Pradel have thought, he who accused me of putting life on a pedestal? I reproached myself for being two-faced, hypocritical, but I never once thought of denying my nature. I want life, the whole life. I feel an avid curiosity. I desperately want to burn more brightly than any other person, no matter what kind of flame. I was on the verge of admitting the truth to myself. I was sick of being a disembodied spirit. Okay, so now we can know. Okay, so Simone de Beauvoir. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I'll give you just a little bit of a background about who she was before we start talking about her texts and her ideas about love. You can see, I don't know if you can see the dates here on the span of her lifetime. She was born in 1908 and she died in 1986. She lived in France most of her life, though she traveled extensively. I think it's worth noting that the historic life that she lived is positioned in a continent that was experiencing, Europe in the 20th century is one of the most, you guys get it. A lot happened in Europe during the 20th century. And she's very much informed by this. In a sense, she's one of the philosophers of coming out of this sort of continental tradition at the time that most plainly allowed the events happening in Europe, like World War II, the Holocaust, et cetera, to inform her work in a concrete way. A lot of the male philosophers at the time saw it as some sort of goal to keep their abstract ideas about human existence sort of above the fray of real life. And she actually was she was challenged by World War II, and she believed that no philosophy mattered if it wasn't rooted firmly in a context. So just to give you a sense of the time that she's alive and kind of what her rights were as a civic being, in 1880, that was the first time that France allowed women to attend university at all. By the time she earned her Ph.D. from the Sorbonne, I believe she was the 9th woman ever in France to earn a Ph.D. The Second Sex, which we'll be talking about here in a little bit, was published in 1949. Women got the right to vote in France in 1944. So just getting a sense of kind of when she's writing and the context under which she lived. So she was born to a pretty well-to-do family. They weren't uber rich. They were a classical sort of European bourgeois family. She made it very clear to her family from an early age that she did not want to get married. In some ways, it ends up being a little bit of a relief to her father when they lose a lot of their money. As she gets older and they realize they cannot provide her with a dowry, which dowries actually still existed when she was alive. She was totally stoked when she found out that they lost the money and lost the dowry, because then her parents were all about sending her to college, which was all she wanted to do. So she was like, that's great. So I want to give you a sense of her education here. She earned her bachelor's degree in 1925 in math and philosophy. I don't have this up here as a PowerPoint, but she then went on. It's kind of hard to compare our degrees to the Sorbonne's degrees at the time, but essentially she passed somewhere between master's exams and PhD qualifying exams in so many fields that I probably am going to forget some, but it's Latin, psychology, sociology, the history of philosophy, philosophy proper, and philology, right? Then, in 1928, she achieved her PhD from Sorbonne, which is the place to get your PhD in philosophy. So if you notice here the math, if you guys can see the numbers here, the woman achieved this at 21 years old. And this is not, sometimes when I teach this to my students, I think there's this, we have this sort of misconception of history where we think, well, it's just it was easier back then or something like that. I guarantee you nothing was easier about education in the past. If anything, things were much more rigorous, right? This woman was a badass on any standards of this. So she's in school with, I'll come back to that here. So her degree, her philosophy that she chose to study, she's an existentialist philosopher, meaning if you're unfamiliar with the existentialism, it's a movement that begins in the 20th century. In the it's kind of debated whether it's actually a thing called an existentialist. They tend to say that there's no such thing as being a thing, so they would say there's no such thing as existentialism. But I can say that there's a few things that we can sort of tease out about the philosophy. They do believe, unlike maybe Descartes or something like this, they do believe that the subject is not just somebody who has consciousness or who's somebody who thinks. The subject also has to act in the world. The subject has to make choices. They have to be sort of engaged with the world around them, otherwise their subjectivity is valueless. And I think that's important as we think about her relationship to discussing men and women, and thinking about women as passive objects and men as active subjects, right? So the existentialist framework, it can't just be conscious, you have to be shaping your consciousness actively in your life. They also believed that there's no inherent meaning to life. There's a very famous sort of existentialist statement: existence precedes essence. So it's not as if we are born into the world with some sort of essence or personality or way of being, and therefore we exist in that way. It's more that we exist, and through that process of existence, we develop a concept of an essence. Do you hear the difference? Right? It's a pretty radical claim. And I hope that it's clear from the beginning why this will be very useful to something like feminist theory, right? To say that women do not have an essence, or men do not have an essence, but that you develop these essences through living in the world as male or female, right? This is going to be the sort of basis for the second wave of feminism and our critique of naturalizing gender distinctions. And finally, this is another point that we need to know to understand her relationship to studying women and to her own life. Existentialism, and I believe this quote comes from, or this idea comes from Sartre, which I know I'm saying it wrong, but I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to say Sartre. That human beings are condemned to be free. So they believe that we have absolute freedom, but within that absolute freedom, there's this profound responsibility. If there's no preconditioned meaning for existence, there's no purpose for your life, you are free, but therefore it is upon you to construct the meaning of your life. And it's a burden. It's a heavy burden. And also importantly, from thinking as moving forward tonight, if there's any sort of ethical boundary they ever come up with at all, because if there's no truth, if there's no point, there's also no ethics. She writes a very important book on this called The Ethics of Ambiguity, where she's like, well, then why aren't we all just raping each other, right? She's like, actually, we can be. That's the problem with existentialism, right? What was I going to say? Oh, I think I lost my train of thought here. What was I saying? I think I made my point. Yes? Okay. Okay, so, yeah, we're good. Moving on here then. So she's an existentialist, she's also a prolific novelist, and she's obviously a professor. It's worth noting her entire life, none among her peers granted her the title philosopher. No one allowed her the title philosopher. She got a Ph.D. from Sorbonne in philosophy, was never granted the title philosopher because she wrote about women. Okay. Now this is, I know, a somewhat problematic thing for me to do. There's already probably some smart feminists in the room who are already angry because I have this point up here, right? Can anyone sense why? Right, often, so Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir have been called the most famous and arguably the most important couple of the 20th century period. The way they chose to live their life was a very political one. They based their romantic relationship around their existentialist beliefs. And so, it's kind of like, John and Yoko or something like that. It's like he's the major rock star of European philosophy. Like Sartre was like it, right? Until Foucault came along, and then, right? But Sartre was the bee's knees, and he actually really embraced and accepted this role. He liked being a rock star. And so, they're just, in France, like intellectuals become famous, right? So they're a super famous couple, and so people are really fascinated by them. And what they're fascinated by is not simply they're two famous philosophers, they're radical, that, I'll show you guys a picture of them with convening down a river with Castro. But they also, it's the way they chose to live their life. Is anyone familiar with their love life? Anyone know the story of them a bit? Yeah, okay, so they have a very fascinating story, and it's the reason I, as a feminist, am not uncomfortable including her relationship with Sartre in a discussion of her is because I think she would find it absolutely crucial that we start there. I think that she believed her relationship with Sartre was as political and as intentional as anything she ever put into writing. And I think she believed it was as difficult as any philosophy she ever worked through. And so I'm not discussing her relationship with Sartre because what's interesting about her is that she dated a famous dude. It's about her and how she chose to shape this relationship that was so public and so meaningful, and she used it as kind of a sounding board and a way to work through her own philosophical dilemmas about being alive and being a woman. So Sartre and she, they were together for 50 years. 50 years. They never married. They basically sat down. At one point, Sartre he proposed to her, and she was like, I think she said, "Don't be ridiculous," right? And he was like, "You're right. I'm sorry." So they were in an open relationship. He said, this is from one of his letters. He said, "We are each other's essential love, I believe, but we need to allow each other, like, I don't know, non-essential loves," which that must have sucked to be one of those, maybe. I don't know. But so they were in an open relationship. They often shared lovers. They had a pretty intense relationship with some of their students. They're, a little bit risque that way, but it's France. And they agreed never to live together. And they actually kind of sat down and they developed a contract. And this is very existentialist of them. It might sound like they're developing this kind of framework that becomes dogmatic, but the idea was there are no given rules, but it is upon us to decide how we're going to live. And therefore, we must adhere to those rules. And so they had to celebrate and protect each other's freedom at all costs, even when it was painful. And she admitted, she was often interviewed, she's like, people are like, aren't you jealous? Because he indulged in the open relationship much more than she did. And there's a few letters, if you read like the letters that are now published between the two of them, it's hard to like him sometimes. Like I love some of the work that he did, but he's basically like, "Oh dear, if you could just grow up a little bit and get out there and have sex, then you would understand," right? And this idea that sort of casual sexual encounters are the same for men as they are for women is a dubious one, right? Women's sexual pleasure is much more complex, so a lot of people would argue, and therefore it's not going to be as easily satisfied in a one-night stand. But Sartre thought that she just needed to grow up a little bit, be less jealous, have more sex. So she was often kind of questioned, like if you're such a feminist, I mean, she actually never called herself a feminist, but she did at the very end of her life, but there's another reason for that. But if you're such a advocate for women, why are you in this relationship that makes you so unhappy? Anyone want to take a guess what her response might have been? I know it's scary to guess. You don't have to. No? She basically was like, happiness is for the weak, losers. Like, I am here to be free. Like, I've got one life to try to achieve some level of authenticity. Happiness, hopefully I can have it sometimes, but that's not what we're here to do. Okay, so this is her. Now let's move on. Okay, well, I guess I'll wait for questions at the end. So this is them. I think this picture is so adorable. This is them later in life. We've got Simone and Sartre and Castro. I just think it's so cute. Okay. Okay. So let's then talk a bit about the text that we'll be reading then for tonight. So the historical context and impact of this work, this is hard to overstate and it's hard to sum up. I'm going to generalize a bit here, but forgive me. I gave you a sense of the historical context, and I don't think I need to belabor that point too much. I think most of us that are engaged with the world understand that women's condition, politically and socially and economically, was different in the mid-20th century than it is now. Arguably, some parts of their lives maybe were better than they are now, but some parts were much worse, according to our values. Okay, so, but I think I want to speak a bit more about the impact of, or the context in which she's writing in terms of philosophy, so just in terms of intellectual, the ethos at the time. This book, it's like 1,000 pages. It's a Bible of thought. And for this talk tonight, it's the first time in the 20 years that I've been going back to this text over and over and over again that I've ever read it front to back. And holy shit, this is a big book with a lot of, it's mind-blowing in its intelligence. But here's what we need to consider, though, what she's up against. At the time that and it didn't really occur to me until I read it this time, because well, let me explain a bit the structure of the book. In the beginning of the book, she starts off with, she's got her introduction, but then she has a chapter on biology, a chapter on historical materialism, a chapter on psychoanalysis. Essentially what she does is she takes on every school of possible thought that has advocated the idea that women are somehow inferior to men. Religion, she has a 600-page section on religion. And then at the second half of the book, the second volume of the book, is then she therefore goes on and explains what it's like to live in a world in which that thought has existed for so long. So how can I state the impressiveness of what she's done here? It's not, so I'm a feminist, right? And if I want to sit down and write a feminist text right now, or an article or whatever, what I would do is probably take one strand of misogynist thought out there, or just sort of gendered, problematics, and I'd engage with that. What she did at a time when literally, I'm just going to say this, no feminist text like this existed whatsoever. She had nothing to fall back on, no footnotes to draw from. The only thing she had to draw from was misogynist written text written by men, right? She had no sort of army of her own. She took on the whole gamut, right? If you read the book, people do notice there are contradictions. She's not always consistent. So for example, when she debunks the notion that there's somehow a biological foundation for women's inferiority to men, and then later in the book she'll use biological arguments to advocate for women's adequacy. So she uses the same sort of methodology that she's critiquing, so there are inconsistencies here. But I think the reason that reading it in totality this time, what I kind of landed upon is it's because she's like taking on all kinds of thought. It's like, imagine she's like, Buffy or somebody, or like a warrior walking through the forest, and it's like she comes upon a werewolf, like there's Marx, pew, like silver bullet, and then she sees Freud, and it's like fire. Like she has to be innovative with what kind of arguments that she's going to use against different kinds of argumentation against women. And so she does become, if you really read it closely, you can see some inconsistencies. But I think we need to be forgiving of her, that there was just no tradition behind her to do what she was doing. I will say, there were women writers who were writing about the issues of gender. We've got Mary Wollstonecraft, Phyllis Wheatley, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Virginia Woolf, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, but none of these writers took on the scope of what Sylvia Plath was, or I'm sorry, what this lady, Simone de Beauvoir, was doing, and none of them developed the kind of coherent methodology. Now, there's a reason for this historically, why this might be the case, right? If you think about in terms of like women's access to higher education, the women that I was mentioning earlier, they were often kind of engaging in political discourse, right? You don't have to have a degree in philosophy to engage in political discourse. She's taking on the philosophers, right? She's taking on the highest educated men that existed at the time, Marx, Freud, etc. So you have to have a degree in philosophy to take these fuckers on, right? Like you can't, does that make sense? Like women have to have access to higher education before they can engage with something like Nietzsche, right? And unless you're just like really, like, does that make sense? So it took this institutionalization of her knowledge to take on the institutions of power that she's critiquing. Okay, so in terms of impact, let me see where I'm at in time. I'll just say very briefly here. The book at the time was both celebrated and hated. A lot of critics said she's clearly having not enough sex. That's why she wrote this book. She had a lot of sex. A lot of people said, oh my God, she's having so much sex. That's why she wrote this book. And a lot of people said she hated women. And I will say, if you read the text, be cautious. It is easy. It's kind of like if I changed the cover and took off a few words or something like that. A few chapters could read straight out of like How to Be a Misogynist Handbook or something. But she's not critiquing women like this. She's critiquing the subject category called woman and how it's been constructed and enforced upon women. And it's important to make that distinction. Otherwise, it does seem like she's criticizing women. And it also seems like she's just super easy on men. And that is maybe something we can discuss, because she doesn't seem she has some critiques against the political category man, but they're not nearly as robust as the one she has against the category of women. Okay. So she makes two major claims in the book. The first one, and at the time, maybe for us, this is a little bit easier to digest than it was at the time, but the first major claim, and notice she says woman. She doesn't say a woman or women, right? She uses that term woman to remind us this is a political category she's discussing. One is not born, but rather becomes woman. So what does she mean by this? In sort of modern terms, she means that there's nothing natural about the political and social and economic inequality of women at the time, that you cannot find an explanation for this in the body, period. And she does a really incredible job of proving this point. Does she deny that women have bodies that are different from men? No, absolutely not. But she's a really sharp philosopher, and what she points out is that that bodies have differences, but differences have no fixed meaning. So, for example, like one common thing that people might point to with regard to why men might maybe have access to greater political power than women would be physical strength, right? I teach women's studies, and students often start here. And it's understandable, right? I mean, it's not that crazy to assume that physical strength, somehow leads itself to political might. But she makes a really great point that physical strength has no pre-given value. We don't arm wrestle to get into office, right? But also, in a more sort of astute point, she doesn't necessarily say this, but I was kind of thinking, I'm a historian of slavery, so I often kind of draw this back to slavery. But actually, the ideology that somehow people of African descent were more physically strong than people of European descent was used as justification to enslave them, right? So physical strength does not necessarily mean political power. These things are always sort of understood within a context. And I can give you many more examples as to how she says this. But there's another thing that we should consider here about one is not born, but rather becomes woman. So there's nothing natural in the body that produces this inferior subject category woman, which she does say is inferior. She's like, yeah, women are politically, socially, economically inferior. And right now, being in the 40s, they're not super capable of achieving equality. It's going to take a while, but that's not their fault. That's hard to read, right? Or even to hear, right? So, but she said there's nothing natural about this. And at the time, again, that was a very radical thing to say. But I think there's something people often miss about this statement, about what she's doing here. She's saying, so one is not born, but rather becomes woman. There's no such thing as woman. She actually says, in her introduction, one of my favorite lines is she says, are there women? Really? Right? She's like, is there a thing called a woman? Right? If it is, what is it? So what do you think? One is not born, but rather becomes woman. Can you guys get a sense? Does she think there are women? Yeah. You might not, at birth, maybe there's no women, or girls, whatever, I don't care, but, girl babies. But, but becoming is not somehow fluffy and easy to erase, right? Once you have become, you are a woman. So becoming does put you into the category of woman, and then you exist. So essence, what is it? Existence precedes essence, but then essence does finally exist, right? So the question then she has, after she's kind of figured out, is there a thing called a woman? Absolutely yes. Well, then what is it, right? This is a very philosophical question. It's a metaphysical question, right? Does time exist? Well, if it does exist, what is it? She's kind of taking that level of rigor. If women exist, then what the hell is a woman? And her answer is one of the most important philosophical contributions, not just to feminist theory, but to all of Western thought, period. And her answer is that women are other. That is the definition of woman. Ouch, right? Fucking sucks. I think she's correct. I also think it's crushing. When I teach the second sex to my college students, I don't teach the whole book, I teach the introduction, and it's an interesting text to teach, and the reaction is always kind of the same. Students tend to come in kind of thinking, they're a little uncomfortable, I don't know if I got it, it's very dry, it's kind of formulaic. And then we work through it together, and by the end of class, there's a sadness. It's a pretty depressing claim, because it feels true to most of my students who are women in my women's studies course. So what does she mean by this category, or this idea that women are other? Well, I'll give you guys a quote here if you've not read the text. She is determined and differentiated in relation to man, while he is not in relation to her. She is the inessential in front of the essential. He is the subject, the absolute, she is the other. And she says this defines women's relationship to their entire existence. So a couple of things to point out here before we move on. The next slide, we're just going to work through this concept of woman as other. But a couple of things to point out here. it's important to remember that what she's saying is that, it's one thing to kind of be yourself and to have there be an other, right? That's the human condition, if you will, right? But what she's saying is it's not a reciprocal relationship of othering, that women are other to men in a way that men are not other to women, right? So that's the problem here. And that's going to shape women's relationship, not just to men and not just the world around them, but probably most sadly to themselves. So they will come to experience themselves in constant relationship to man, even when no man exists. I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but what she will eventually argue is that this, while most human beings experience this sort of troubling break between this sort of unified, primordial, like even divine consciousness and the experience of being self-conscious, aware that they exist and that they're separate from everyone else. She says women experience that in a double way. It's double negation, and that they have two self-consciousnesses in themselves, a man and a woman. And I'll explain how we get there, but she's like, women are always watching themselves be women through men's eyes. They never have an experience of whole subjectivity. And that's when I get to that point with my students, that's when you can kind of start to see the faces change, like, oh, that's the voice in my head, right? Okay. So what does she mean by this, woman as other? Well, we have to start with a very fun guy. This comes from Hegel's dialectic. So Hegel, oh man, what a pickle. Hegel's dialectic, there's a couple different versions of this. The master-slave dialectic, you can also find it as, what is it? Bondage or something like that, I can't remember. But it's easiest for me to draw this. So do I need to have the mic? Can I just move away from the microphone? Okay, so for Hegel, he's writing in the 18th century. To understand how big this dude was, he influenced basically every other major European thinker to come. His biggest influences were on people like Marx. Marx was hardcore into Hegel, but actually challenges some of his ideas. Freud also was hugely influenced by Hegel. Foucault was influenced in him by his negation of Hegel, but Hegel's the guy you got to come back to, and he's a stinker to read. He's very difficult to read. For Hegel, I'm going to draw this on the board because this is the only way I can think. I've been trying to figure out how to make this easy for last week. This is the best I can come up with. Okay, so for Hegel, we've got the master. And the master, you need to understand, is not just... we don't think in terms of master and slave in terms of the American context of slavery or any other direct context of slavery. It'll be too specific if we do it that way. He's talking about anytime one sort of a group or somebody who thinks of themselves as a subject comes up against somebody else that they think as different from them, and they therefore have to realize who they are. So it's a very useful concept for thinking, for example, about when the Europeans arrive and they confront Native Americans and suddenly realize, oh, there's another way of doing gender or doing agriculture, and they have to define then what does it mean to be a European? That experience of self and other, right? And what they want to do is say, you're wrong. Europeans are the absolute. We're the real people, right? You're somehow the exception. You're not the norm. Okay, so the master, I'll give him here. So we know he's master. Okay, so the master, he confronts another consciousness, another being who's just somehow antagonistic to his mere existence. Okay, so she's going to be, sadly, slave. Okay, so what makes her, so he confronts that, he comes up against another existence who is different from him, and in order to maintain his sovereignty, his subjecthood, his sort of grasp on the universe, and he comes up against something that's not like him, it becomes very important to negate her existence. He calls this sublation. So what he does, essentially, so the master is the absolute until he meets an other. He must sublate the other, meaning sublate means not just kind of push under. It's like you make it an extension of you. It's like you chew it up and you spit it back out and it's you, right? Sublation results in the master then transforming the other into an extension of himself. So when the master has this really awesome thing. He lives for himself, in himself and for himself. So when he thinks about the world and existence, he goes like this. This is being alive. This is his thought, and it comes right back to himself. Woohoo, right? Okay, so he's fine. Then he meets her, and he's like, crap. So then he looks, so then he's looking at her, and he's like, well, in order to sublate her, it's fine. Eventually, through this long process, he manages to do this. So he has made her existence about her, right? Are we clear with what's happening so far? I'm kind of negating the process here because I don't have enough time to do that. What she experiences, because she's been defeated by this dynamic, right? So, and this can be any master-slave dynamic, but she's been defeated by this dynamic. She, therefore, has become an extension of him. So when she tries to do this look at the world, she starts here, she comes out maybe, back to herself, and back to him. She can only see herself in the world through relationship to him. That's how her self-consciousness gets doubled that way. Even, and then so are you kind of seeing here sort of their unequal relationship to being conscious? She does have one thing, though, that he doesn't have. It's probably too hard to guess for this, just from looking at this. So remember, he can't, what, this isn't clear? Remember, can he see her? Not really. He sees her as a reflection of himself. He sees in her what is interesting to him, what makes him come into existence, right? He makes her an extension of him. He others her to make himself subject. Because she is defeated by this, because she can't sublate him, she has one thing that he doesn't have, and that's the ability to see him. So she can do this. She can look right at him. And she has to, because her existence depends upon him, so she has to know how to become what he wants. So it's in her interest to know him. It is not in his interest to know her, and he actually can't. Right? So Marx, he'll take this and he'll say, actually, this is a source of power. The working class can see the rich can't see the poor. They can use this knowledge to start a revolution. So I'm just kind of explaining how Hegel's dialectic informs a lot of these thoughts. But remember, she can see him. He can't see her. Can she see herself? No. That's what sucks. He can see himself. Arguably, he sees himself through some sort of narcissism, right? But he can see himself. She can see him, which is a power, but she can't see herself. Okay, so I'm going to have to speed up here a little bit. I think this is pretty much captures the idea of woman as other. How do I do this? Okay. I'm going to speed up through these points here. So what this reveals then at the sort of the end of the day for Simone de Beauvoir is this situation, which is I don't really know how to give this the emotional or psychic weight that it deserves, but what she argues quite effectively in the book is that this dynamic between the masculine and the feminine self produces a world in which man can equal man. Like, to say I am a man can mean I am a male with, a male body, but it can also stand in for saying I am a human being. To be other, to be woman, means she can only be woman. And that is catastrophic to the human psyche, she argues. And it becomes very difficult to overcome that, and it will create a psychic dependence on men that even the strongest woman really is, we're fucked, essentially, she's gonna argue. She gives us some path out, but it's like, dude, that's it? That's like the only thing we can do? Okay. So does this make sense? So what do I mean by this? Easiest way to think about it. If I say I went to a basketball game last night, did I go see men or women? Men. If I went to a women's basketball, so do you see what I'm saying? We mark women as women, but men can just mean men. Another easy term to understand this, and this is the one I think is actually the most potent for us to really chew on. Just the idea that the term mankind can mean both, that mankind typically does mean humanity. And if that seems like a trifling little feminist complaint, it just proves she's right. Right? If the fact that mankind can mean women too, but womankind cannot mean men, only demonstrates how devastating this dynamic has become, that women can't mean human. And women can only mean, and therefore, and the policy procedures that come out of this. So for example, I think up until very, very recently, and it's probably not even across the board changed yet, pharmaceutical companies tested their drugs on male animals only. This is just one example of thinking like the male is the norm and the female is the deviant, as the non-norm body, because female bodies tend to have more hormonal changes, so drug companies didn't test their drugs on female animals. But do you see how that sets up this idea that a body with static hormones is a normal body, right? Why isn't 50% of the population the other normal body? Okay, so, and the other thing here that's kind of devastating is that women, it's not just that women can only equal women, they always equal women. We don't have a chance to equal human. I was just watching the Jen Kirkman comedy special, and she had this great bit on like female comics. She's like, female comedy isn't a kind of comedy, right? Like just being a woman on stage, she's marked as a woman right away, right? And so not only are women only women, like they don't have the chance to speak as human. And for Simone, that's the biggest loss. She wants to be a human being. This is why some people think she hated femininity. She loved femininity. She was like, I just found this line at the end of the book today where she was like, and for anyone who tells me not to paint my nails, that's ridiculous. Like she loves femininity, right? But she doesn't understand why painting your nails can't be a human expression. Why is it feminine? Whereas masculine pursuits can somehow become the norm that we're supposed to ascribe to. And in a world that's been largely governed by men and on masculine values, in a world that it looks like the one we have, why do we value masculine values as the human values, right? Okay, so, and then finally here on the condition of being a woman, what's unique about this is there are many others. I'm going to move on here to talk about the other. There are many others, but for women, what's so challenging for them is that, so I'm trying to think. So she talks about the proletariat being an other to the bourgeoisie, right? But the proletariat's goal is to abolish class relations, and so that proletariats no longer exist. She's like, women can't have that desire. We can't wipe out womanhood. We also don't really want to wipe out men. And she also compares this, she was very influenced by, I should have mentioned, on her first trip to the United States in the 1940s when she saw American race relations. And that really helped her crystallize in her mind this concept of other and the way American blacks were treated. And she said one difference for women, and I know this is like, I'm going to talk about the problematics of that category, is that she said, blacks have a past. American blacks have a past, she writes. There was a time that they know that they were not subjected to European or Americans. They have a memory of something else, and women have no such memory. There's no place that they can go to, right? Whether or not, she's not a historian, I'm just going to mention that, but I think she's at least right that women didn't experience themselves as having a past that's different from this. Okay, and finally then, the problem is we then come to see ourselves as others. So what happens then when the other falls in love? Well, she argues these 2 points here. For women, love becomes then a loss of self, that they have to, actually I'm going to kind of back this up, yeah. For when women fall in love, because they don't see themselves as essential and as whole, and they see men as essential and whole, and that in order to fall in love, they have to become somehow what his vision makes her to be, right? And it's consuming, right? She said that women, there's such a great loss of power when a woman falls in love with a man. And I should say that this talk right tonight is geared toward the sort of heterosexual pairing. But for men, she argues, and I know the tendency is going to want to be like to come up with all the different possible personal exceptions you can think of, right? But just don't do that. It's just not useful, right? It's because she's talking about broad political thought, right? And if you try to pick at it by thinking like, well, yeah, but I know this one guy, this one time, it just doesn't help, right? So think in terms of like the political narrative that we live by. The reason he's an exception is because these norms exist, right? But in general, for men, she argues, when they fall in love, it becomes a way to annex another onto themselves and help to build and crystallize their lives. That they don't have to give up part of their absolute status. They don't have to give up their subjectivity or their grasp on the world the way a woman does. And therefore, falling in love only sort of reinforces his master status. For her, in order to be lovable, she has to disappear. Now, all that's well and good. I mean, it's actually it's horrifying. But she says something this was about 2 years ago, and I was reading this again, And I found this line, and I was like, holy cow, this is interesting, right? She's a tense, thick writer, and you got to read her slowly, and you got to read her closely. But she says something about all this. She's, if you just when you're getting to the point where you're thinking, yeah, women really like guys, right? Like women are really into dudes or really into love. She's like, no. She's like, this is not about you. Women, we don't love you. We love your freedom. The reason we are more drawn to you than you are to us is because you are free and we are doomed to eminence. And she's like, there's something in us that longs for freedom, that longs to be released from this sort of trap. She calls it, we are being trapped in the sphere of the relative. I mean, think about that, being trapped in the sphere of relative. I'm only known in my relationship to men. Not even like the man in my life. Masculinity in general defines what makes me a woman. And that's a constant, everyday experience. And she's saying that it's not masculinity or even men that we love so desperately. It's the fact that they are not defined in relationship to anyone else. And that looks like freedom, and it's like we're moths to, like as soul-starved people that have been oppressed our whole lives, we're like, oh, I want that. I want your freedom. And that's why women love harder, she argues. She's like, our dream of annihilation, that thing, make me disappear, make me fall in love with you so hard I can't remember my own name, is actually because I long to be free. Isn't that badass? That's interesting to me. So I'm running out of time here. I can talk about sex in the Q&A if we need to, but I want to make sure I cover a couple of other points here. So she writes, the tie that binds her to her oppressor is unlike any other. The women are in fact doomed to this in their relationship to romantic love. The couple is a fundamental unit with two halves riveted to each other. This is the fundamental characteristic of woman. She is the other at the heart of a whole whose two components are necessary to each other. So, okay. I think we're kind of clear here, I hope, right? Just give me some love. Say, yeah, totally, it's all clear, okay. So what I'd like to do then, the next few minutes, is I'd like to, as much as this book means to me, I'd like to pose two problems that I see with it, and not because I don't love it, not because it hasn't been so influential to me, but because it's so important. It pricks at some questions for me that I think are worth considering. So my first one is, you can't see the top here, but it says, in defense of the dreams of annihilation. So there's something about her work here. Do you see what she ends up arguing then for women in love is that in order to achieve transcendence, in order to escape this, we need to come to think of ourselves as whole beings who are not dependent upon another for happiness or existence, right? I mean, this is a very common trope, isn't it? If I stood up here and told you I'm a very independent, individualist person, would you be more impressed by me if then I said I'm like whiny and pathetic and needy and I desperately need to have someone to live, right? We live in a culture that celebrates individualism and independence, right? And so she wants women's liberation so badly, and the only way that she can imagine this and escaping this dynamic is for women to achieve the same kind of subjecthood and freedom that men have by divorcing themselves of that dependency. But my question for her, I think I know what she'd say, but my question for her is, but doesn't a feminist critique of capitalist patriarchy, which she was a socialist, denounce individualism and embrace interdependency, right? Is she not in this work somehow then, in her critique of the relationship between men and women, isn't she somehow maybe celebrating masculinity to the point where the way women love or the way women come to need one another or form bonds is sort of the basis for their lives? Is she somehow critiquing something that's not just about critiquing women? Is she upholding a political regime or an economic system that's actually sort of the cause of women's fall? Does that make sense? My other critique against her is a little bit more subversive. And that is the value of masochistic annihilation. I will say in her chapter on sexuality, she writes, she's totally fine with sexual masochism. She writes some of this beautiful stuff I've read on the value of pain in sex, and she's like, yeah, it's great. She's almost like anyone who would question it, she's like, what are you, daft? She's like, pain is the only way you know you have pleasure. She's like, it's a beautiful passage. She's like, you have to be snapped out of the pool of pleasure so you can get back in it again, right? But my complaint here to her is this. There is something about the text overall, I think, as brilliant as she was, she could not lift herself out of the 20th century. Like, oh, yeah, like, shame on her. You couldn't divorce yourself of your entire existence. But, I mean, the 20th century was the century of selfhood. I think we're still stuck in this. But the mid-century, right? I mean, right, you know, buy a house, get married, fill it with crap, exercise every day, have children, make sure, don't just have children, make sure they're happy, make sure that there's children, have happy children, like, improve thyself, you know, make thyself a worthy being. And when we get to folks like Foucault and other thinkers later in the 20th century that are really sort of sick of this regime of selfhood, I do find something sort of radically liberating about denouncing the self as a project. Whether or not that means letting oneself disappear into love, into drugs, I don't know. I mean, I'm kidding, but not really. But I think, I hope this point is clear here, that there's something in her work that she's still sort of holding on to this sort of sovereignty of the individual that I can't help but feel is a celebration of masculinity. And so my last point here then before I go to why should we love like men? Why should we think of ourselves as separate? Is it a fallacy to imagine that human beings are not incredibly dependent upon one another? And what if there is possible liberation and freedom through complete subjection of the will to another? Second complaint I have against her, and it's not a complaint, it's a loving nudge. Others. So I didn't bullet point this, so where am I at in time here? Okay, so a few more minutes, okay. I'm going to go back to the board. So one of the problems with her work too, and again, I don't think it's one that she can't somehow solve, and I think in some ways she does later in the text. But okay, so if these are the two others that inform the entire human existence for both men and for women, is it clear that she's ignoring then that for many groups there are other experiences of being other? And that the relationship between men and women might not be the most salient othering in their lives. So, for example, I study American slavery. If I could somehow get in a time machine and go back in time, and I'm a white woman, and I go up to the black women on the plantation, and I'm like, hey, sister, we both have something in common, because we're both women. It'd be really annoying to them. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, their experience of being other was so much more informed by race than gender, that for me to come to her and say, no. Being a woman is your common experience. Being black is secondary, right? That's incredibly problematic. And if this is the only other that Simone de Beauvoir is interested in, it kind of it undermines her argument. So if we've got what she's asking us to do, essentially, let's say that this is one group, like this is one nation, one tribe, whatever, and this is another group. And within this group, men trump women. I use that word on purpose. And men trump women over here, right? And she's saying this is the othering that we have to get over. In order to do that, and let's say this group right here dominates and trumps this group, right? Well, what she's asking us then to do is for these two groups of women to assume they have something in common to fight against this relationship, but for this woman, that woman is the enemy. Does that make sense? And she negates that. And then finally here, before I've got two more points here to wrap up with. I'm gonna go over time. I'd like to, I'll actually let you guys decide. Would you like to watch a little bit of Nina Simone? Okay. And then I'll close with one quote from Simone de Beauvoir, and then I'll be done here. But there's something that I also see, and this is my not critique of her, but this is, and I will say I didn't think of it till I watched this performance by Nina Simone, and it's Nina Simone singing "To Love Somebody." That was the Bee Gees, yeah, right, Bee Gees. Okay, so the Gibbs or whoever wrote that song. So you don't know what it's like to love somebody the way I love you. And there's a line in there where he writes, "I'm a man, can't you see what I am?" And there's something about watching Nina Simone, thinking of all of this in common here, that when she changes the lyrics just a little bit, there's a few places where she changes the lyrics. We're just going to watch sort of 2 minutes of this performance. And she says, you don't know what it's like to love someone the way I love you, somebody. That changes so dramatically in meaning, I think, when she says, "I'm a woman, can't you see what I am?" The way she's sort of critiquing that a man cannot possibly understand what it's like to be a woman in love with a man. right? She can see him, but he can't see her. So she can know what it's like for him to love her, but he will never know what it's like for a woman to be in love with a man who signifies her oppressor. That's a unique experience. But there's something about this performance that's so fucking incredible, because when she says the word, but I'm a woman, it's crushing, but it's like she's embracing it, and she somehow finds in it a place of power that I do not understand. Like Nina Simone found power in this position of submission, and she makes it her own again in a way that only the performance can explain, that I think somehow Simone de Beauvoir is missing the possibilities of subversion through gender performance. Okay, so we'll watch just 2 minutes of this, and then we'll come back to Simone for a minute.
You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to love somebody, the way I love you. Gotta do the last verse again, just for myself. Hey now, in my brain, I see your face again. Cause I know my frame of mind. Nobody has to be so blind and so unfeeling, but I understand I'm blind. So blind. But can't you see what I am? I live and I breathe for you. Good does it do? I ain't got you. Child, I ain't got you now. See, you don't know. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to love somebody. To love somebody. I ain't finished to love somebody. To love somebody. To love somebody. The way that I love you.
I think her there's something about her standing and staring at the audience in that moment here. We can talk more about the performance here afterwards, but I'll just move on. There's something about the way she says the word woman, and she gets so deep into the pain of being in love and the powerlessness of the lyrics that she's expressing there. But somehow when I watch that, I'm like, she's totally in charge of herself. And there's something about the subversiveness of claiming that position that I think perhaps Simone missed, and her sort of celebration of the absolute. So in closing here then, I wanted to come back then to her relationship. I debated between titling the slide "The Philosopher in Love" or "The Personal is the Political." I went with "The Personal is the Political" because it is a phrase that's very much inspired by Simone de Beauvoir's work. It's the second wave of feminism's major sort of, it's their poster, if you will, like "The Personal is the Political." For a long time, I think I misunderstood or only half understood this concept. I thought when I was a young feminist and studying this stuff, I thought what it basically meant was that things in politics had personal implications, right? So who is president will personally affect me as a woman or personally affect my life, things like this. I've come to understand that it means something so much more than that, and something much more kind of daunting and maybe crushing, that like there's literally no part of our personal lives, and Simone would argue, especially for women, that are not politicized. She does argue that for men, romantic love can be at least experienced as apolitical. But for women, it's always political to be in love with someone who possesses the political position of superiority over you. So I'm going to close here with two quotes. One is something that probably pissed off feminists more than anything else she said, but it's one of my favorite quotes that she ever said. So this is after Sartre has died. No, sorry, this one is after, this is on her, this is right before she dies. So Sartre dies before her. It's a very romantic story. I find it romantic. She doesn't even tell anyone he's dead. She's in the hospital with him, and she crawls into bed with him, sleeps with his corpse for a day after 50 years of love and partnership. Years later, she's dying. She's on her deathbed, and people are aware that we're about to lose one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, and she's being interviewed by philosophers and by feminists. And she's asked at one point, what are you most proud of? And she said, the greatest achievement of my life was loving Sartre. She wrote like 20 novels, right? She wrote this book, right? And so it's like, wow, what do you do with that, right? And I'll admit, I was among those who at first found this to be kind of outrageous, right? That I was like, what are you doing? Like, you're subjecting us back again to this dynamic. And I think there's multiple ways that we can read this. One of them is, it was really hard to love Sartre, right? And I managed to do it for 50 years. But I think the other is, in keeping with that, is that she chose to love romantically in a world that allowed her very little freedom within that relationship. And she valued the love, and she managed, as a writer, if you continue to read her work, this woman never disappeared. No matter how much she may have disappeared into her relationship with Sartre, she never disappeared as an author. And so I do see this as an achievement. I think I understand what she's saying here, that this was politically rigorous work to maintain this relationship, and it informed who she was as a writer. And so as a woman, I think it's very important that we listen to women and allow them to speak for themselves. She's a very smart person. If she says this is the best thing she ever achieved, then I've got something to learn from that. But we're not stopping there. I just couldn't stop with that one. This is from The Second Sex. And then a lot of folks, and she admitted, every once in a while there's a passage that's very angry in a really lovely and beautiful way. And she's like, yeah, that's when I was kind of talking about Sartre. So I'm going to close here by sharing then, just she wants to remind women in their relationship with men of the following. So this might be a little hard for the guys in the room, but that's okay. It is difficult for men to measure the enormous extent of social discrimination that seems insignificant from the outside and whose moral and intellectual repercussions are so deep in woman that they appear to spring from an original nature. So here she is saying men can't possibly see the constant daily discriminations that women experience. All they can see is the result of these things, and they therefore blame women for their own inadequacies that are the production of patriarchy itself. And she's like, they can't see us, right? So she reminds women, there is no ever, like a good reason ever, to believe men when they try to defend the privileges whose scope they cannot even fathom. We will not let ourselves be intimidated by the number and violence of attacks against women, nor be fooled by the self-serving praise of real women, nor won over by men's enthusiasm for her destiny, a destiny they would not for the world want to share. So That's it. Thanks, everybody.
If you're all not rushing out, we have time for 2 or 3 questions. So just raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone over. And thanks for hanging with us.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Any
There's one
questions?
back there.
All right, hold on.
This is my first talk, and it was awesome.
Oh,
I'll stand
awesome,
up. Okay, I had to write it down because I'm a
cool.
little drunk.
No, I get it.
So, what are your thoughts, or what do you think are her thoughts on the view of women viewing other women? There's always this idea that we act for other women and we dress for other women. Is there some sort of camaraderie that should be there? And do you think that there's like a third level of self then? Because we're thinking about what other women think of us.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. She doesn't write about this as much as I would like. She has this. There's something about the way she's trained as a philosopher, and she was smart. She would have, the moment that she would have inserted herself as a female author, it would have been ridiculed as a feminist text. Just to be clear, this was initially categorized by the Library of Congress as a biology or a zoology textbook. That's how there was no feminism. And they had to assure the editor, no, this is not feminism, in order to get it published in the United States. So she could never write, to answer your question, she could never even talk about her relationship to other women. In her novels, you can see her talking more about other women. But she does have a few chapters in which she writes about how this relationship is so oppressive and so isolating for women that it makes it difficult to form sisterhood. And she has a really great line in the introduction where she simply says, women don't say we. We don't say we and mean women, right? Like there's no sisterhood at the time she's writing. And she believes that that's going to have to be the place of revolution. I promise I'm not going to talk about this, but there is a point where she says, though, women have to stop identifying as women without trying to be like men. Women have to start embracing the subject category of human, and therefore, eventually, the subject category human will include women. And so it's a very complex question, and it's a good question. For your first question, like, really good job. Any other? Yeah, I've got time for a couple more.
Okay, hang on.
I'm thinking about your critique about, what if interdependence is actually better?
Wait, can you repeat
I'm
the
thinking
last?
of your critique of what if interdependence is better than individualism, but given that she was an existentialist, wasn't that her number one rule?
That you had to
right?
be, that the individual's freedom reigns supreme.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm a historian, so there's probably a lot about existential philosophy that I don't quite understand, but she was also a socialist. And so, I'm going to answer your question by kind of going at it in a sideways route. One of the problems, when I'm saying that, I am thinking more as a historian, and I think one of the things she's missing here is that historically, women have not been as in love with love as they have been since the 19th century. So she does have a section on history, and it's just pretty flawed. She argues that women have always been oppressed, and it's just arguably not true. And it's actually, it's with the rise, I would argue as a historian, it's with the rise of industrial capitalism, when women's labor within the home and within this sort of extended kinship network gets sort of debased and devalued with work moving outside of the home, that women start to have an actual economic dependence on men, and therefore somehow it's there's got to be able to, why would you get married? Why would a dude marry a woman when he can just go buy stuff in a store and go to a prostitute? Oh, because they're in love, right? So then romantic love becomes the way women somehow create their value within a post-industrial society. And so that's a long answer to say that there's something about post-capitalist bourgeois individualism that I think is inherently degrading to those who don't have as much access to the workplace, and therefore making the access to the workplace the goal is only going to increase stratification between people and among women. So currently today, 75% of field labor in the United States, exploited field labor is performed by women, 90% of sweatshop labor is performed by women. And so as women try, like a woman becoming CEO of Pepsi or something like that, that's not a feminist achievement. That's a horrible capitalist achievement, right? And I'm not proud of that at all, right? So I think that my goal as a feminist would to see us rejecting individual gains at the expense of others.
One final question, if there is one.
Her hand went really high. I saw
Really
it.
high, really fast. Okay.
I can speak loudly.
Thank you.
What do you think her response would be to a lot of Persian poets back in centuries ago?
Oh, yes, I'm so glad. Yeah.
Yes.
Keep going, yeah.
For example, Rumi would
Oh, yeah.
say the definition of love is to lose oneself.
Yeah.
And he wrote a lot of those poetries for another fellow poet philosopher, a male poet philosopher.
Yeah, I'm so stoked you asked this question. I actually, for a while, had in the PowerPoint a discussion of Hanuman, that, for lack of a better term, the monkey god, who was defined by his utter devotion to Ram, right? Like there's a point in the Bhagavad Gita where he just like, when he's questioned like how much you love Ram, he takes his hands and he like rips his chest open to demonstrate that Ram's name is written on his heart. And that doesn't make him a weakling, that makes him a god in the Hindu tradition, right? So this idea that like utter annihilation of the self can actually be contact with the supreme, or the divine supreme, right? Yes, I think about Rumi's writing all the time. It's Rumi, right? He's saying like you only become when you are destroyed through grief and love. And that it's a source of empowered strength, right? Like you get closer to God. God's dead for her, so that's kind of the problem. Yeah. So, yeah. That's it. Okay. Thank you guys a lot. That was awesome. So.